Hi, my name is Misty Fiklinski, and Erica Reed and I are doing our project on the Dixie Valley toad. The Dixie Valley toad lives in the Great Basin area of northern Nevada, and it was only recently described as a distinct species from the western toad. It was already in peril at the time of its discovery, and researchers did genetic analysis to determine that it is a distinct species from the western toad, and they published their results in 2017. So right now, there's a lot that's unknown about the Dixie Valley toad, and that shows that more research is really needed to learn more about them. I haven't been able to find any population estimates, and little is known about their feeding habits or water quality requirements. We do know that they need wetlands in order to survive, and they need them to be warm for their eggs and for their tadpoles, and they also need vegetation for shelter, brumation, and for hunting. They are a small toad. They're only about 2.5 inches long as adults. The Great Basin area where the Dixie Valley toads live is typically very dry, and there are small patches of wetland areas and streams formed by hot springs beneath the Earth's surface. And the toads live within a 760-acre area in Churchill County, Nevada. And it's significant because this is the only place where the Dixie Valley toads live. In fact, they're rarely found more than 46 feet away from these wetlands. And here you can see on the map the really limited area where they live. The green area shown here is the range for the Dixie Valley toad. And the existence of hot springs also makes this the exact type of location that would be desired for developers for geothermal plants. And these type of plants would withdraw groundwater from the springs and streams and use it to create power before re-injecting it back into the earth. After the toad was initially distinguished as a separate species, the Center for Biological Diversity filed a petition requesting emergency protections for the toad. Now, about 90% of the toads live on Department of Defense land at Fallon Naval Air Station, and the other 10% live on Bureau of Land Management lands. In 2021, the Bureau of Land Management Stillwater Office approved the construction of the Dixie Meadows Geothermal Development Project, stating that the project would have no significant impact on the toad. And this is when we start to see a lot of litigation regarding the Dixie Valley toad. Geothermal energy sources are renewable energy sources that are typically considered green, and the plant began construction in late 2021. Now, this prompted the Center for Biological Diversity, along with the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe, to file a lawsuit against the Department of the Interior to prevent construction. This area is considered sacred to the tribe, and they wanted to protect it. So the two organizations obtained an injunction, but it was later overturned in court. So the Center for Biological Diversity also filed a lawsuit against the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and wanted them to complete the protections for the toad. And so that was granted to the toad in December of 2022. Now, since then, Ormont Technologies, which is the developer of the plant, have threatened to sue the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in order to have the toad delisted. So while the lawsuits continue, they have agreed to stop construction, leaving the plant partially completed, awaiting further studies to take place. This is a photo of the partially completed geothermal plant, and while it is the biggest threat to the Dixie Valley toad, other threats include climate change, groundwater pumping associated with human consumption, agriculture, and community planning, and also predation by the North American bullfrog, which is invasive to this area.
Feeding off of what Misty said in the previous slides, I'm covering the research, monitoring, and intervention parts. So the first one I wanted to cover here is the research March through May, breeding by observing different activities such as amplexus, which is where the male and female mate, egg masses, and tadpoles are done. Toadlets were fully metamorphosed by 70 days after egg laying, and then the preference of warmer water, which I found very interesting because that the Citrodimycosis fungus can't live in these conditions, and that's a big ordeal for certain amphibians and frogs in certain parts of the world. And USGS actually found that toads prefer warmer water, particularly in winter, and it's thought that they could do this so that they don't freeze. And Fish and Wildlife Service thinks that this is a unique adaptation for this species. So A lot of these studies are done by Nevada Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, Nevada Division of Natural Heritage, USGS, and then United States Fish and Wildlife Service. Here I've added at the top a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service article that they wrote, and I just highlighted some of the important parts that I've pulled from that. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has partnered with Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Navy, and they're actually providing funding to USGS and Nevada Department of Wildlife to determine certain life history characteristics. The toads are actually highly associated with water and are rarely found far away from it, which provides the incentive for these frogs to be around that critical habitat that Fish and Wildlife Service are fighting for. So survival rates, growth rates, number of eggs laid, and how long they live or life expectancy are all determined. So they've been using this to do certain studies. The species is relatively new in terms of doing works and studies on. And so in this next slide, is discussed, and this talks about how in April 2022, there was actually an emergency protection that was placed on these frogs. And this lasts for 6 months, and so in 6 months they decided December 2022 that the Endangered Species Act was actually going to protect this species. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife, as of May 2024, has proposed that 930 acres are to be designated as a critical habitat, but all of this is still up for debate, as you'll see in our interview with one of the Fish and Wildlife Service employees. There's a lot of different litigation and legal aspects that they have to go through before actually passing this critical habitat proposal. And I just added here some different threats that the species encounter, and this picture is actually an area where these Dixie Valley toads are found. But it says these will protect against threats such as geothermal development, disease, predation by other non-native frogs, groundwater pumping for human and agricultural use. So in our next little bit here with our interview with Haley Van Scoik, she's actually going to talk about some of these threats that happen to certain amphibians. So this is our continuation interview of the Dixie Valley toad. I'm Erica, and then I'll let Misty introduce herself.
Misty Fiklinski.
Okay, and then Haley, you can introduce yourself.
All right, I am Haley Van Scoik, and I work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Okay, and then the first question, a little bit of background. In our presentation, we discussed that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service plans to make 930 acres a designated critical habitat for the Dixie Valley toad. And then our question was, how will critical habitats help conserve or protect an amphibian like the Dixie Valley toad?
So, as you're probably aware, but amphibians are like a unique group of organisms. So they're extra sensitive to their environment and specifically environmental changes. So because they respire through their skin and because they rely on a water source for some period of their life cycle, that makes them extra sensitive to these environmental changes. So they come into contact with a lot of contamination through those two avenues. So like for an example, here in Michigan, we have a problem with salting our roads. So we use road salt to help with ice, and that eventually will leach into roadside ditches, which is a critical habitat utilized by a lot of amphibians. And so this creates unfavorable conditions in those roadside ditches for these amphibians because it's raising salinity levels. So again, as I mentioned, they're breathing through their skin and they're using that water source, which could have, pollutants from other things on the road, so such as oil spills, anything else that's running off into those drains. So there's two layers of kind of pollution that they're dealing with. So then this makes for improper breeding because the salinity levels are being absorbed through the egg skin, they're being absorbed into the juveniles. So there's a lot of juvenile mortality because of this sensitivity. Another kind of example, and a little bit different, there are a lot of frogs and toads use calls to detect their mates and find mates during pairing. And so even something as sound, so the sound pollution from highways, airplanes, interstates, trains, those can actually disrupt breeding seasons because these toads and frogs rely so heavily on sound to locate potential mates, this actually results in less successful pairings of mating. So coming back to your question of why critical habitat is so important to protect and conserve for these amphibians is because they are so susceptible to external in their environment that we have to make sure that there is the best chance for these things to have successful breeding by removing any sort of, pollutant, whether that's a physical pollutant such as something like salt or oil or farm runoff, whatever it may be, but also removing other pollutants that we don't necessarily think about, such as light pollutants, which is a big thing for reptiles, and even sound pollutants. So by kind of like looking at the habitat as a whole and creating habitat that's going to promote successful breeding, successful pairing, successful mating, that's what's going to continue on these species and help these populations that are at risk rebound from whatever devastation that they've been dealing with.
Yeah, I saw where Fish and Wildlife just, I think in May, they have like 6 months to do a bunch of litigation stuff about passing that as a critical habitat, but hopefully that'll go through. But me and Misty haven't seen any results from that yet, which I told her Fish and Wildlife has a lot of legality side of it that they have to go to. And then the next one was, are you aware of any endemic species similar to the Dixie Valley toads that are, kind of experiencing the same problems that they're experiencing? Or if you want to elaborate on that, Misty, you can elaborate on the specifics of endemic species.
They had tested the water and, removing the water for the geothermal plant and then pumping it back in, but they didn't really spend a lot of time on the other effects of, light pollution. And of course, these toads are kind of small, and if there's a lot of traffic, to and from the plant, I'm sure that would cause a lot of mortalities on the roadways. So anything that you have that's a similar type situation would be interesting to know about.
Mm-hmm. So kind of just another endemic amphibian. It's not really a frog, but it's also facing problems with habitat degradation through various different means, and kind of kicking it again to the more Midwest, which is where I'm based out of. So in Ohio, they have an endemic species. It's called the Eastern Hellbender. It's one of the largest fully aquatic salamander species. And so it has, I think, a little pocket population in Missouri, and then the majority of the population is in Ohio rivers. And so this is an endangered salamander species, has been for years. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of amphibians are susceptible to pollution, whether that be introduction through the water or other through the skin. So it's been in decline since the 1970s, and it's primarily due to degradation of their critical habitat. So they really need clear, cool, rocky rivers in order to survive and flourish, I guess. So obviously, there's always the big question of climate change. So warming waters is a big issue for them, but there's also siltation. So that's, going in, dredging these rivers that these salamanders rely on and live in. By going in, dredging, you're creating a bunch of silt that is, making the waters murky. It's, getting in their gills, going into their skin. It's helping move, pollutants down the system, pollutants from a lot of farmland. So in Ohio, there's a lot of farm fields. So obviously the runoff from that's going into these rivers, creating, again, a big issue. And then even something as small as like gravel disturbances. So these salamanders are very, very susceptible because they rely so heavily on this rocky gravel for not only camouflage, but parts of their life cycles depend on certain size of rock substrates. Even though, like how you were saying with the toad, they, have done a little bit of the water stuff. They're not really finding anything detrimental at this point, but it may be because they're overthinking or not looking for something, because you never know how something so small can actually have such big impacts on these species that are so sensitive to changes in their environment. And so with the Hellbender, there's obviously a big stocking effort that's going on as well to try to rebound those populations, and then along with public education, which is a big component of the Fish and Wildlife Service, is going out and educating the public on these issues so that they can be part of that change in helping out with these organisms.
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing all that, Haley. I think that covers all the questions that I had and covers everything. If you have anything, Misty, you can add on to that.
I think that covered everything. Thank you.
All right.
All right. Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Haley.
No problem.
All right. See you later.